Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What I was saying was that we did have a long, humid summer, and so I'm so glad to see you all in good health. You know, people used to say that when America coughs, the world catch cold. But now, some journalist a few days ago wrote in Financial Times to say that when China sneezes, the world catch bird flu. Bird flu is, more difficult to treat, to deal with. It's more painful. What that means is Chinese economy is that important. According to the World Bank estimation, the China surpassed the U.S. economy last year. But even with the exchange rates, China is only second to the U.S. Currently, U.S. is somewhere around 25% of global GDP, and China is maybe about 15%, still lower. However, the third Japanese economy is distant behind, only 5 or 6%. China is that important. Furthermore, this China has been growing fast. As you know, during the last 35 years, Chinese economy had been growing almost at 10% per annum. You know what that means. 10% growth means every 7 years, the economy doubles up. That is the reason why Chinese economy now is reached to 15%, and pretty soon it'll reach 20% and will surpass the U.S. economy, even based on exchange rate. This Chinese economy has been slowing. According to IMF's most recent World Outlook, next year Chinese economy is expected to grow at 6.8%. Even Chinese government been saying that they foresee the economy grow around 7%. They don't say exactly 7%, but around 7%. What that means is it can go even below 7% or a little bit over. This is the current situation. Only a few years back, among Chinese policymakers, any growth rate below 8% was almost a taboo. You never talk about low. But now, China is in this situation. This is what is called the new normal, or in Chinese, Xinjiang. Now, because of this adjustment, global economy has been impacted, of course, in many negative ways, particularly those resource-rich countries which have been relying heavily on China, starting from Brazil to Chile to Australia and South Africa and Russia and Indonesia, and all these countries been affected. Of course, Korea also affected, because although we don't export the resources, but we export most intermediate goods and capital goods. And also we export a lot to those resource-rich countries too. So, and then those resource-rich countries, since Chinese demand is decreasing because of slow growth, there again, and at the time when the market is expecting U.S. Fed's short-term interest rate hike. So they are now suffering doubly again through their currency depreciation and capital outflow. So we've been observing all turbulence and the volatility in international capital markets and the financial markets. Now, this morning we have very, very interesting and the best speaker to enlighten us regarding all these current issues. David Asher has a very, very interesting background, and he is a very, very interesting person, first of all. David is currently he is adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security in New York. This is a very hot new research institute in Washington. And also he is a partner of the venture capital with his brother. And he is advising the world's largest hedge funds, a couple of them. You know, so he knows the market. And also he worked for the government, so he knows policy as well. So since it's very interesting to know about his background, I'm going to tell you this right here. Asher is fluent in Japanese. Don't say anything bad in Japanese, he would understand. and he got a PhD degree in international relations with a focus on economic history, which is good, from Oxford University. And then his dissertation, doctoral dissertation, examined the failure of economic reform in interwar Japan and the rise of military nationalism. So he has expertise here, so I'm sure he will tell us a lot about what's happening today in Japan in this regard. And then, you know, prior to I mean, afterwards, and he served in the government. For example, from 2001 to 2005, he served as senior advisor for East Asian and Asia Pacific, Pacific Affairs at the Department of State, where he was also the coordinator of the North Korea, the working group, and directed a restricted policy coordinating committee at National Security Council. From 2002 to 2004, he was the coordinator of the U.S.-Japan Strategic Dialogue for the State Department, and also advised and participated in strategic dialogue with ROK, Korea, and the People's Republic of China. From 2001 to 2002, David was a Sherpa for the U.S.-Japan Economic and Financial Revitalization Dialogue between the White House and Japan Prime Minister's Office. Asher covered Asia as a consultant for two macro hedge funds in the 1990s and 2001. During this time, David helped the Japanese government develop the policy for what eventually became the Industrial Revitalization Corporation of Japan. So he has been quite influential in Japanese policy making as well. And again, he is also a good friend of Korea and good friend of mine, and he visit us very often. He is interested. I just gathered that he's persuading his the group and many financiers all over the world to do more in Korea. Well, he was with us before, so this is second time. But I'm very sure he will enlighten us on these issues. He's not afraid of being controversial, so I'm sure he will tell a lot of things in candid way. Well, please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I love being here in Korea, and I wish I was spending more time. I'm going to be try to spend more time here. In addition to my think tank research and my investing work in venture capital, which I'm very interested in venture opportunities here in Korea, actually. So if anyone has any good ideas, just let me know. We do a lot of early stage investing, which makes us different than many others. We do companies earlier in their growth period, and then frequently work with larger firms. The Kleinwerts, the Kleiners and the Foresights and the Venrocks and the really big guys later on. But we're a good way to get into the venture world. But I want to say just first, 14 years ago at this hour in Washington D.C., I was in the middle of the biggest crisis of my life. We were attacked 9/11, and it was amazing thing to see, just absolute chaos and indecision and lack of clarity and the fear, frankly, that was running among all of us. I was involved in helping getting the State Department evacuated, and then went to our off-site facility to try to be in contact with the White House, with the president. We were trying to get in touch with the president. And our secretary is in South America, and all I can say is that one thing that we need to think about is the unthinkable. Okay, I've lived through the unthinkable, and one of the unthinkable events you've always thought about here in Korea, you haven't had to deal with, is of course what happens in the north. But you've had an unthinkable thing happen here before, and that was the Asian financial crisis, which I don't think anyone really expected would occur at the level of severity that it did. I'm not saying it's back, but I'm saying that I see the emergence of the type of characteristics in the financial markets and in economies and in politics and strategies among different states that opens the door to actually a different and potentially even more complicated, more distressing situation. It is not necessarily a situation that Korea loses out in, actually. It's just a situation that if Korea doesn't have a strategy thinking ahead, it will be a problem. I think it's a situation also where countries that have been relatively quiet in terms of their actions, even though their words have been very often very loud, like China, may begin to start to play a more decisive role, partly shaped by their own economic inadequacies. So these are these fault lines. Fault lines are when you have an earthquake, that's a fissure is a hole. A fracture is when something breaks. And a failure, well, we know what a failure is. So I'm looking at the new Asian economic disorder, and I hate to point at the U.S., the world going over Niagara Falls, or the image of Statue of Liberty going in the ocean. But I just want to, I want to, and I want to stress that I'm speaking strictly personally and thoughtfully. I'm not representing any of my clients or my think tank. But face it, the true economic growth rate in China today, based on my calculations and frankly many other market economists, is less than 3%. 3% is optimistic, actually. Moreover, the RMB, the renminbi, is at least 20 to 25% overvalued according to the IMF's own analysis. And I think the balance of payments, despite the huge reserves that China has accumulated, could be strained in the coming year. Even without a revaluation, well, especially, because if the Chinese try to keep defending their currency at this level, they're going to start running out of money. One thing I should point out, China has used its currency reserves as collateral on a lot of other investments. So it's not necessarily all money in the bank they can just intervene with whenever they want. It's very hard to understand the structure of that. I'd like to learn more here in Korea because you guys know a lot. It's very obvious that China's own internal disorder is impairing its emerging markets, EM, and developing market trading partners, including you, and I would consider you in the developing markets now, and will lead to a greater global commodities and energy price collapse. I have been very, very aggressive about trading global commodities on the short side and global oil. I have been extremely short oil for 9 months. It's been a very profitable trade personally. I see no reason to stop. I'm back planning for the market to fall much greater level. And part of that's shaped by geopolitics, by what's going on with Iran and what's going on with Saudi Arabia. We'll talk about that. The problem is the new Asian economic disorder could turn into an outright Asian financial and economic crisis unless we get some decisive reflation in China and other economies, structural reform, much talked about, not much done, and free trade. TPP is really important because it'll create a sort of anticipation of greater integration rather than greater disintegration, which is where we're going right now. The Chinese economic crisis, moreover, is not about the economy necessarily. It's about the Communist Party. It's almost like Karl Marx or or Lenin would have anticipated this crisis. It's between capital and labor, except the capital is in the Communist Party and labor are the people. So it's a very interesting situation for the Chinese. The elites, the capitalists, mercantilists are the commies, not the So it's almost like Marx could predict what's going on in China. My fear is we saw with Russia in the Soviet Union when it went through its crisis in the 1920s. And you had the rise of Stalin, and I'm predicting that President Xi is like Stalin, but without a change in his economic strategy in line with his announcements, just based on his own current trajectory, they're going to be much more nationalist, mercantilist, and I believe expansionist. That's why they're showing all these weapons. They can say everything they want about peaceful intentions. I don't believe it. Asia's economic and political disorder is part of a broader decline of hegemonic and political, military, economic stability globally. I frankly blame the United States in part for this, and I'll blame the Obama administration in large part, but the Bush administration started it, unfortunately. So this is the Li Keqing Index. Before Li became premier, he said he had little faith in Chinese official GDP. He preferred instead to look at electricity consumption, rail freight volumes, and credit growth. So we've constructed our own China momentum indicator using these variables, estimating appropriate weights and seasonal factors, and then based on that, Chinese growth is 3%. Now, some people say, and I hear this from many economists, I'm on the board of the Bank Credit Analysts, so I'll be using a lot of their statistics. It's a very famous financial publication in global markets. Worth Koreans looking at, by the way, because it covers all global markets. It's Canadian, not U.S., and we do long-term data sampling, long-term data analyses. And this is a sample. This is an example. This goes back to the mid-1990s, early 90s. Look at how low all the leading indicators based on the Chinese own statistics that we've constructed, including some of the China's own, like the Chinese own statistics, now National Bureau of Statistics, they're at the levels of the crisis in 1997, 98, and 2007, 2008, 2009. We're heading right in the exact same direction. This is their data. Now, you could say the Purchasing Managers Index is a little more optimistic, but I can say also that the problem is this. Inventory accumulation in China is going through the roof. That's why we're seeing some of the export statistics show huge volatility, where they're essentially dumping. And it's going to become a big issue in the U.S. Congress soon. Consumer confidence has been one holdout, but the problem is that, when people start losing their jobs, they're going to become less confident. China's faced with an existential crisis due to its own currency policy. This is the U.S. in real effective exchange rate terms. Okay, everyone's talked about how much the dollar's rallied. Look how much more the renminbi has rallied over the last 5 years. Why have the Chinese authorities let their currency go up this much? I think it's because they got, frankly, a little bit arrogant. They got very full of their economic power. They thought they were the new, like there's the World Bank statistics that Dr. Sakong was quoting. They were the new second, or first largest economy in the world. They wanted to create, as Governor Zhou of the central bank outlined, a renminbi clearing sphere for currency in Asia. They wanted a strong renminbi to be able to project power through AIIB, their infrastructure bank. I think they've been living a dream that will now become a bit of a nightmare. They will argue today that their currencies remain significantly overvalued, and I talked to the Chinese about this. And if you look objectively, this is Japanese exports is blue, and then Eurozone exports is green, and then China exports. So China, except for these dumping, see, that's dumping. When you get a statistic jump like that, that's when somebody's, letting massive amounts of excess steel or something hit the market, or aluminum. The thing that the problem is, and this data is not even updated for the latest statistics. I didn't have time to do it. This is from last month. Since they devalued, and this is what happened, the trading band was increased in March 2014 by 2% in the renminbi, and then the stock market, and as the stock market in Shanghai started to fall, outflow of capital from China started to increase, and it became like a waterfall of capital flowing out. The latest data is about down here. It's like I can't even point at it, so low. I mean, it's literally the latest last month there. I'll show you in the next slide. There's just no way they can maintain this currency level in my mind, because they're facing a run on the bank. A lot of Chinese companies, a lot of Chinese entities, I'm not sure if they're all companies, are setting up these import-export dummy companies. So they're buying stuff, like in Singapore, but they're not really buying anything, from what I hear. They're just exporting capital to places like Singapore, maybe even to Korea, for all I know. I mean, you'd be interested in your knowledge. And so what's happening is they're falsely invoicing their imports into China to get the money out. So what's going on is there's a huge decline in the renminbi foreign exchange reserve. So this is extreme. Anytime you see some move that large in 1 month, $97 billion U.S. drop, that's bad. And then the question is this really going to steady the A shares? Well, it's had some impact, but the thing that's really steadied the A shares after this currency drop, that's the yuan to the dollar, and that's the Shanghai Stock Exchange A shares. It's been the fact that they just stopped the market from trading in many ways. It's not just price-keeping operations like the Japanese did in the old days. And by the way, it looks like the Japanese are doing it again at some level if you look at the market the last few days. It's a type of just shutdown of the market mechanism, which is a real clear indication, by the way, that the Chinese Communist Party is threatened by capitalism, even though it's a capitalist communist economy. These contradictions are really, really important to understand what's going on. I mean, it is almost like Karl Marx is writing the book of Chinese economy right now. So what's happened, though, is China's creeping devaluation has led to a collapse in the MSCI Emerging Markets Index. This is an absolute collapse, the level of which we haven't seen in a long time, really since 97, 98. So the Shanghai Stock Exchange is also sort of, back where it started a year ago. Compared to the Kospi, compared to the Topics. What happened, I think, is in March of last year, the Chinese government was facing an economic downturn, the beginning of it. And they decided, basically, to create a financial bubble of sorts because they allowed incredible amounts of leverage to be used to buy stock in Shanghai. I believe, and I'm not an expert on this, that Xi Jinping's grandfather founded the Shanghai Stock Exchange. I need some historian of Shanghai Stock Exchange to tell me this, but I've heard this from people. He definitely has an affiliation. Of course, what's happened is the yuan and the won have had to be in a sort of competitive situation because Korea, as an exporting state that is very much integrated with China, has got to sort of echo the policies in effect. And I don't blame you. But are you ready to let your currency drop 25% more if the Chinese let theirs adjust in October? You got to start thinking about it because Korea and China's economies move hand in hand. This is Korean exports to China, South Korea. I love this country, like I said. But your industrial production is almost in total dovetail. It follows almost very closely the exports to China. So your economy basically is being driven by Chinese demand, whether you like it or not. And, in some ways you like it. China's been a growing, doubling its GDP every 10 years, as Dr. Sakong pointed out. Problem is it's not doing it now. In fact, import volumes from China, look, this is China's import volume. It's falling. Import volumes across emerging markets are falling. These are bad leading indicators. Emerging market bank stocks, which I watch very carefully as a leading indicator, they're falling at the fastest level since 2008 crisis. It's just the velocity. But what makes this crisis different than 97, 98 is the incredible run-up in private sector corporate debt across the emerging markets, especially in Asia. A lot of it is people building, you know, big Korean steel maker building an Indonesian steel, you know, plant. People building mines, doing lots of mining projects in Australia. I mean, the amount of leverage associated with these projects is extraordinary. It's, you know, over 30 trillion US dollars. So, I mean, people are like, is an Asian financial crisis, an emerging market crisis going to affect the world economy? I'm like, definitely. Definitely will. And you can see that market capitalization in emerging markets has been really collapsing. The interesting thing is developing markets have been increasing. I mean, I was tempted to bring a slide to show you of the performance of the U.S. during the Asian financial crisis. I could probably pull it up. But the problem is this, and this is a problem we're going to face again with the U.S. leadership, especially at the end of Obama. The U.S. in 97 and 98 was growing economically at 4.4% average. The stock market went way up. Inflation went down. Price of gasoline drove consumption because price of gasoline collapsed. People were driving like crazy, buying, you know, internet stocks, second houses. America did not really take responsibility for the Asian financial crisis. You know, people like Dr. Sakwong took responsibility, but I've done something very bad here. I need help.
My responsibility.
There it goes. There you go. That's what happened.
Right.
There we go. That's the crisis right there. It's a simulation. We just did a simulation of the Asian financial crisis.
Yes.
But look at so you know, China's real GDP is falling, but so is U.S. household debt. The interesting thing is China's consumer of last resort is the United States, but the U.S. consumer has been remarkably stingy, remarkably conservative. They were burned by 2008 crisis, and they've changed their behavior fundamentally. It's one of the reasons why our economy is growing not as fast as people have hoped, but at one level that's good. We have no inflation and we have full employment. Okay. Emerging market currencies have been dramatically impacted. This is FX losses and gains since 11 August 2015. Basically, the average emerging market currency is trading about 4% off, which is in line with where the Chinese are. But everybody's been hit. Exports to China as a percentage of total exports for like Australia, it's over 30%. Taiwan, 20%. Korea, over 20%. But if you look at the value added to China's percentage of total exports, excuse me, that's the total value added, excuse me. The exports as a percentage of total percentage of GDP are much less, excuse me. In Korea, it's like, or Australia, it's like 9%. In Taiwan, I think it's like 15%. In Korea, it's like, you know, 14%. I'm guessing this number. But the value added is high. You know, I mean, maybe I can explain it a little better this way. Imports in China, you know, are you know, a lot of what Korea is doing are being imported into China. I mean, the first thing that China is doing, though, is not from Korea. It's importing from emerging markets materials. But then industrial machinery, a lot coming from this country. Energy is the other piece, and that's coming from the Middle East and from Southeast Asia. Manufactured goods. The key thing is that China's very much, the world economy is very much leveraged to China, and China's much leveraged to the world economy. It's not at all isolated. We see some very disturbing trends. Asian ex-Japan export growth has been falling at a very, very rapid pace, the most rapid pace since the Asian financial crisis, actually. And export volumes are in an absolute contractionary phase. Now, this is especially problematic because the whole world trading system has not recovered from the 2008 crisis. We're still down like 12 or 13% in global trade. I get worried about this because at the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about how this fits in with history, not just talk about, you know, what's going on in the current data. I mean, obviously, one of the things that's falling off the fastest is mineral fuels. We're going to see huge bankruptcies in a lot of industries, I believe. And one of them is going to be the gas and oil industry. What bothers me today also is inventory in North Asia. This is Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Massive inventory increase, not as massive as 2007, 2008, but this goes back to all the way to 2002. I could take this back to 97, and you'd see this is the last time we had inventory build like this was like 98. You know, so, you know, the question is, what's going to happen with this inventory? I think a lot of it's going to get dumped. The problem with dumping, and this is why TPP is so important, if we do not get TPP, we're not going to really have a firm, clear global trading order, okay? The rules of the WTO are already broken down. The World Trading Organization is becoming increasingly irrelevant to world trade. The whole dispute settlement mechanism is broken down. So when people start dumping, it's going to lead to protectionism. We can't, in America, Donald Trump will be leading the charge on protectionism, that crazy guy. So here's, just look at this, US dollar versus emerging market currencies. It's a trade-rated index going back to 1997 equals 100. This is how much more dollar-denominated emerging market debt. So we're up over 40% in terms of the dollar-denominated emerging market debt over the 1997 level, 7.4% increase in 2014 alone. Companies like Asia Pulp and Paper, the biggest bankruptcy in the history of Asia, $14 billion bankruptcy on bond default, I should say. The company went into default on $14 billion in bonds. But guess what? Its creditors were never able to take control of Asia Pulp and Paper stock. They escaped to China, essentially, and they moved a lot of their money there. So what happened was the emerging market debt market never got smart. It's very stupid. And so, you know, a lot of people have been smart to issue the debt, but there's just going to be a lot of defaults. Who holds all this debt? Well, a lot of them are being held, again, in CLOs and other structures that are owned by money market funds. So the danger is, of course, that, you know, China coughs and we all get the avian flu, and it affects even our, you know, bank accounts. So, you know, this is just a sign of how much debt there is compared to 96. I mean, you know, basically everybody's at least is indebted. Indonesia is the one that looks different, but that's because they've been borrowing so much in the Singapore banking system and they've been issuing debt in Singapore. Singapore has become the massive financial hub. And look at this, okay? This is going back to 1999. Singapore total private debt as a percentage of GDP is 290% of GDP, okay? Look how much it's increased. It's skyrocketed. Singapore bank stocks have gone way up. Look at them now. Is this market going to fall? Real estate prices in Singapore, it's breaking down. Everybody's been putting their money in Singapore as sort of safe haven. Hong Kong too. These markets are in a bubble. I mean, Singapore has been a very stable, important, you know, player in Southeast Asia, and I have a lot of respect for the authorities there. But they're facing they're doing what I heard from a senior Chinese official, who explained his fear of the real estate bubble in China when I met him a few years ago. He said, Asher, let me explain what it's like. Every day I wake up and I feel like I'm riding a tiger. And he said, you know what the problem with riding a tiger is? And I said, no, sir, what is it? When you fall off the tiger, he eats you. That's what I think can happen. Why is there a reason to think that this could become an outright financial crisis? Well, Forex reserves, Asian current nations have accumulated huge currency reserves, but these currency reserves are falling year on year like crazy. Now negative decline. So unless something changes here very soon, we're going to start to reverse the huge buildup in foreign exchange reserves. Moreover, credit growth in Asian and Latin economies is still increasing. So actually, even though it's declining, the pull, a lot of those are export oriented. So there's a sort of a negative cycle in play that I could be worried about. And even going back to Singapore, current account balance, everyone's like 23%. IMF says, oh great, there's no problem there. Look at the capital outflow, financial capital account balance, negative 23% of GDP, the exact same as the current account surplus. Their current account surplus gives them no security. The one-year swap spread on the Singapore versus U.S. Dollar is at the highest level since the Asian financial crisis. That's 1997. This is today. Now, could it go up there? Well, certainly if we keep seeing the currency outflow at the level we're seeing here. You know, I mean, so, you know, they're maintaining their currency like the Chinese are maintaining their currency, but there's going to be a breaking point. And one of the things that's going to break things down is just the massive flood of oil. Now, at one level, oil is really good. There's lots of reasons why, again, in a country like Korea, if you can diversify your economic strategy a bit, be more consumer-oriented, which you've been trying very hard, and I know you've had some success with, this price of oil is collapsing. I mean, look at the production in OPEC. It's totally it's unstoppable. And it's because of politics. Iran is threatening Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The Saudis are flooding the oil market in retaliation. It is an oil war, economic warfare. And this is a thing we need to think about. We've had economic warfare before. Saudi in 2012, in order to try to enforce the sanctions against Iran and to put pressure against the nuclear program, flooded the market. Oil price collapsed. it's happening again, 2011, 2012. And then, you got Iraq coming online, huge surge in Iraq production, huge surge in Saudi. What does this mean? And then, the LTO production, i.e. the shale fuel in the United States, skyrocketing. I'm guessing that 50% to 60% of all U.S. shale oil producers will be bankrupt by the beginning of next year, okay? But that doesn't mean they'll stop pumping. This is not major oil producers. These are owned by medium-sized, small companies. They're highly leveraged. They borrowed a lot of money. I used to lend money to shale oil producers in the United States. If they go bankrupt, guys like me who have the credit, we're going to seize the collateral and we're going to pump every drop we can from those oil wells. So the total supply is not going to stop. We're going to see a massive washout, I predict. I believe that Brent crude will be at $35 by the end of this year, WTI at $25. Now, gasoline in the United States and Korea and Japan is going to be, in China too, to the extent they let it be unregulated, it's going to be the cheapest in history. So in that sense, if you can reorientate to the consumer, it's going to be great. In fact, a lot of industrial production and a lot of chemical industries, there's a lot of people that can win in this scenario. They're going to make huge profits. But people that are leveraged to those credits in the oil sector, including some of the oil majors even, are going to fail. I mean, look at the price of Chesapeake, the big, natural gas producer. It's like at $2 or $3 something. I mean, these guys. I mean, I don't quote me on the exact number, but it's really low. I mean, their stocks are predicting some sort of problem. But look at the commodity cycle. This is China. This is all China. So this is the price of copper. Okay, on the right-hand scale. Left-hand scale is gold. This is a tale of gold and copper, right? Booming and busting. This is the price level through all the boom and bust cycles in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and this is today. This is not going to last. I think we're going right back to there. When that happens, is the Australian, gold industry going to survive? I doubt it. I mean, it'll survive in that somebody else will buy it. Maybe we should all put a fund together and we'll buy some gold mines. It's going to be real cheap. But I mean, the point is, but credit default spreads. This is in Asian metals. I just ran this yesterday. This is CDS for Asian metal producers. They're not predicting. I mean, there was a much higher level of default prediction back in 2012, 2013. It's extremely low. The markets aren't pricing this. Even the credit default spreads for Asian super senior credit defaults, in China and in places like Malaysia, which is, where's Malaysia on here? But I mean, Indonesia is there. They're about 240% above. The sort of swap, the 5-year lending rate. I mean, frankly, the likelihood of defaults in Malaysia is probably twice that. Okay, and so the markets are not. I mean, credit default markets are not deep enough, frankly, to be necessarily accurate predictors. But they're not predicting. That's what I'm telling you. The markets are mispriced. Credit ratings, though, are more accurate, and the credit rating trends are definitely in a negative direction. You see lots of green is downgrades. There's a lot more downgrades than upgrades emerging. Why does this matter from a strategic standpoint? Because I'm going to quote from the U.S. National Intelligence Council report from a few years ago. Because the world, and now I'm going to get into the sort of international relations part of the talk. So give me 15 minutes to talk about the world, and then I'll shut up. This is the CIA's National Intelligence Council. In 2025, I think they're probably right. Relative certainties. A global multipolar system is emerging with the rise of China, India, and others. The relative power of non-state actors, business, tribes, religious organizations, and even criminal networks will increase. Continued economic growth coupled with 1.2 billion more people by 2025 will put pressure on energy, food, water, and resources. That pressure will occur whether there's growth or not, just because of population. So economic growth does not have to occur. It's going to be even more pressure if there's not economic growth, actually. The potential for conflict will increase owing to the rapid changes in parts of the greater Middle East and the spread of lethal capabilities. Well, this was written 4 years ago, okay? The spread of lethal capabilities in the Middle East is unbelievable right now. The spread of actual, the actual rise of warfare. By 2025, a single international community composed of nation states will no longer exist. Power will be more dispersed with newer players bringing new rules of the game, while risk will increase that the traditional Western alliances will weaken, i.e. the alliance here, the alliance with basically almost everybody the United States has alliances with around the world. I actually think the alliance between the ROK and the United States is in pretty bad shape right now and getting worse. But the problem, and then shrinking economic and military capabilities may force the U.S. into a difficult set of trade-offs between domestic versus foreign policy priorities. Donald Trump, okay? The guy's maybe crazy, but he's not foolish. So the need for the U.S. to act as a regional balancer in the Middle East will increase, although other outside powers, Russia, China, and India, will play a greater role than today. What these guys miss, though, is what's going on in Asia today. And what's going on in Asia today is not just the Chinese economy booming. It's been Chinese defense spending skyrocketing, okay? China is not a status quo power. It is going to seek to dominate the South China Sea as the U.S. dominated the greater Caribbean basin. It's like a Monroe Doctrine. And that's exactly what they just did with this parade the other day. Did you notice how many steps the soldiers were making? 114 steps, and they were marching, and then they stopped. Why? 114 years ago was the end of the Sino-Japanese War. Who lost that war? Well, China, you guys. Taiwan. What is China saying to us? What are they saying? They want to change, they want to reverse history back toward the world that existed before the Sino-Japanese War. I'm pretty worried about that. Look at how many incidents there are. This is from actually a couple years ago. We did a study at CNES on how many incidents they're occurring, just on a yearly basis in the South China Sea. The Chinese have been, this chart is interesting because this is from like 2.5 years ago. This now, there'd be so many red dots on this in terms of maritime incidents between Chinese Coast Guard or Chinese naval vessels and other regional vessels. It would be colored with red. The chart wouldn't even matter. You couldn't even read it. Reefer madness. You probably can't translate this. Reefer in the United States is a slang for marijuana. So we're joking. They're building these coral reefs. My dear friend Admiral Harry Harris, who's our PACOM commander, calls it the Great Wall of Sand. Where they're building these. Let's look at what they're building. They're building landing strips for airplanes in places like, in the South China Sea. Okay, what makes this, I needed a bigger map and I don't have one. What is equidistant between here and here? What's that over there? What country is that? Taiwan. Taiwan. I'd be very worried if I was in Taiwan. I'd be very worried looking toward 2017, which, will be an important anniversary date for the Chinese Communist Party. I'm very concerned that this infrastructure will take about 2 years to finish in terms of full military facilities. I think they will finish it. There's no reason they spent this much money building it. This is because as the Chinese economy slips, the mercantile imperialist side of China is coming out. And look what they're showing us. They're showing us missiles like these missiles here that can be launched and they can destroy our aircraft carriers. Okay? They can also be launched and destroy Yongsan base probably, for all I know. I mean, these things are extremely fast, extremely accurate, and very, very scary. But then they showed us their new bomber. Finally, we've been hearing about this bomber. This thing can drop nuclear weapons. This thing can drop massive conventional payloads, and it's refuelable. It can fly to the United States. What was happening at the same time they're doing their 114-step, march? They're sending 5-ship flotilla to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, coming into my country's territorial waters. The most provocative demonstration of force and, frankly, a violation of my country's sovereignty that we've seen ever out of the Chinese. Even the Russians don't do stupid stuff like that often, okay? But what's even more stupid is that China's cyber offensive operations against all of us, including you, are out of control. It's just absolutely, they're treating the world system as if they can just rip it apart. And the thing about cybersecurity is, and why it matters, is that the world runs on the internet. And so globalization and cyber integrity are integrated together. And the danger is cyber thievery, cyber espionage, stealing intellectual property that's taken billions of dollars in investments by Korean companies and American companies to develop and stealing it for nothing and then building the exact same thing in China without paying us any royalty. It'll undermine capitalism. If you want to promote a communist system, or a socialist system, I guess that's one way to do that. Well, guess what? Why does this matter? Because I'm an economic history guy. I did my doctorate in economic history of Japan, but I had to study at Oxford all economic history going back to Babylon, because they make you do that at Oxford if you want to do a doctorate in economic history. I studied the economy of pre-World War I Europe for one of my thesis papers. Pre-World War I Europe is sort of a very good analogy to where we are today. And it's not just on the strategic level, which many people talk about. It's economic. Pre-World War I, we saw a breakdown in the long cycle, the balance of power and hegemonic stability, and maybe repeating itself. What was the breakdown? 1814 to 1914 was the longest period of prosperity and economic integration in world history until 1947 until today, or 1953 until today, I guess you'd really argue. 1953 is probably it. So, and then moreover, the CIA says there's going to be a multipolarity among competing powers. There is not a single historical precedent in world history, as a historian, for a stable transition to multipolarity, and that is economic, political, and strategic multipolarity. China is on a course toward militarized hegemony in Asia based on its actions and its words, while America is a reclining power whose actions don't match its rhetoric. Pivot to Asia? How about retreat to Asia? You know, we're really trying to get out of the Middle East and come here because we don't like the Middle East, but we're stuck there. The dark side of globalization, you know, cyber, crime, everything, it's expanding. Warfare is getting flat. It's getting very cheap to fight asymmetrically. So a lot of things, so a lot of the systems that we built, the balance of power system is very fragile to outside intrusion, as we learned 14 years ago today at this time when the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were getting attacked. Okay? Much depends on whether the U.S. can become a globalist power. And a globalist power means not a global power. We're not the only power, but we want to lead the globe. We want to make the globe a safe place for all of us to trade and for all of us to prosper. We need to do that again. But instead, our policy is to shield ourselves from a dangerous globe. That's what President Obama is doing. I'll just get through this quickly. Again, we've seen this movie before. Convergence, globalization, that's what happened in Europe between 1870 and 1914, particularly on the industrial level. Massive increase in economic integration, cross-border capital flows and foreign direct investment boomed. Foreign assets accounted for 7% of global GDP in 1870 and nearly 20% by 1914. We didn't reach that level of integration again until 1970. So that's how long it took to rebuild the global system. So when the global system breaks, it really breaks. And I'm suggesting we're at a breaking point. So this is just a great growth wave in the world. You know, it was up to World War I. What happened before World War I, 1907, there's a financial crisis. This is German economy. This is before the war, and then the war starts and it gets worse. England, they all were trending downward. One of the reasons why the British Empire and the Germans and even the Russians and the Japanese all wanted to start building these ships is their economies weren't doing well. It was an iron and rye versus sort of a butter. They were trying to replace excess steel capacity by building or use excess steel capacity to build a lot of ships. So they built these big long-range warships, the dreadnoughts. That helped set the stage for the crisis that occurred with World War I. They built these weapons, these asymmetrical weapons like the Chinese are building, and when things got economically bad, they decided they had to use them. And one of the reasons they had to use them is, here's Great Britain after the Boer War in 1905, before World War I, the Great World War I recession. The British felt that, why did Britain go to war in World War I? It's always a mystery, right? The Kaiser, Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets shot. Why does that mean that Germany and England had to go to war? Really, seriously. I mean, the German and England leaders, were the king and the Kaiser were cousins. They were friends. Didn't make a lot of sense. But the Brits and the Germans both felt it was use it or lose it. Germany, interestingly, everyone thought Germany was the rising economic power. It was, but the bigger rising economic power in 1914 was Russia. Hard to believe. 5 years later, Russia was, destroyed and the communist country was emerging. But that's how quickly things can change. I see Germany today, China today, a little bit like Germany was in 1914. It's a use it or lose it type situation. Their hopes and dreams of empire are sort of crumbling. Now, one of the things that's also been crumbling in the last few years is productivity. Productivity before World War I started to decline after all these huge years of increase. That matters, okay? Because today, emerging markets, advanced countries, productivity is tanking. It's even worse, and that matters because when productivity starts to decline, people start to do stupid stuff. It's hard to maintain economic growth when productivity is declining. It literally can't be done statistically. So, you know, it brings out the worst in countries. So why am I concerned? This is from 1924, July 4th. Uncle Sam leaning backward, reclining, and there's a firecracker in his butt, you know, about to explode. Pretty scary. But this is why, after the Washington Naval Conference in 1921-22, the U.S. basically got out of international relations. Sort of familiar, doesn't it sound today? President Obama, last 2 years. So again, the free trading system's in decay. Global financial status of the U.S. is diminished, more or less. We have fiscal imbalances, anemic economic recovery. These are all classical signs of a hegemonic decline. What happens at the end of hegemonic declines in history? War. Usually world war in the last 2 times. So I see a lot of potential for war to occur. And in fact, I see wars already begun. In the Middle East, Saudi and Iran are in we call the Muddled East meltdown. The Middle East has now been renamed by Mr. Armitage the Muddle East. It's a mess. But Saudi and Iran are at it, and Iran is fighting with the Houthi rebels in Yemen to try to take Saudi's eastern province oil fields. Hard to believe that they can do it, but the Houthis in Yemen are related tribally to the eastern province Shia. They're cousins. They're part of the same tribe. So from Iran's perspective, this is a fight over the control of oil and the control of Islam. It's a very significant thing. I saw it in Iraq. Is there a possible implosive conflict in the Korean Peninsula? Well, I don't know. But there's possibility where you actually try to do some sort of quiet reunification, gradual deal like Park Geun-hye, your president, has suggested, and the Chinese or the North Koreans take advantage of it. I mean, I'm concerned about this presidential cup tournaments you're going to have. I've been reading about this, seeing the papers. I'm like, isn't October 10th the 70th anniversary of the North Korean Workers' Party, I think, or something like that? I mean, it's a strange date to be holding a golf tournament in Incheon, if you ask me. I'm a little concerned. And that doesn't mean you're going to have a war, but I mean, again, the possibility of people doing crazy things provocatively, especially desperate economies. The reason why this matters to financial markets, and I'll be almost stopping here, is war is usually what breaks down the long cycle in financial markets. 1914 war led to a huge implosion, which only was rebuilt after World War I. 1973, and this is also how inflation starts. Everyone's been waiting for inflation. We're not going to get inflation unless we get a supply shock. But when we get inflation with this much monetary ease out there and this much money floating around, it could be really huge inflation. Let me just talk about my friends in North Korea, okay, just because I can. North Korea, okay, is a commodities exporting country. The most important military company in North Korea is called KOMID, Korea Organization for Mining and Industrial Development. I'm asked very, very often, how does North Korea finance its weapons of mass destruction program? Simple, coal and gold. What's happened to the global coal market? It's collapsed. What's happened to the global gold market? It's collapsed. What's happening to the North Korean GDP? It's collapsing, okay? I mean, it is really in trouble. So what does North Korea do when it doesn't have money from normal sources? Well, it's going to engage in a lot of illegal activities, of which I went after many. I stopped lots of counterfeit currency and all that stuff. But it's very difficult for them to counterfeit our currency today. So we've redesigned it to, spend a lot of money. What does North Korea really want to do? I think they want to export nuclear weapons. And I think that they've got an agreement to export nuclear weapons to Iran, personally. And I think it's based on logic, not classified information. I'm speaking strictly about what's in the public eye. And moreover, they want to deploy and export nuclear-capable ICBM. There's a missile called the KN-08. The KN-08 has been talked about in front of Congress by the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, by the chairman of the Joint Staff, by Director Clapper, the DNI, and by General Scaparrotti, our friend who's the commander here. And what have they all said? It's capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, they believe, and delivering it as far as the United States. If the KN-08 is tested in the next few months, which, who knows, it could be, they're going to have to test it eventually. They spent a lot of money on it. That's not a KN-08. We don't have a picture of a KN-08 flying since they haven't tested it. And it comes at the United States, even in the test. It's going to be a total crisis in our relationship. I mean, the American people, what's Donald Trump going to say when somebody lets a North Korean ICBM be tested against the United States? And then North Korea comes out and says, we've weaponized our ICBM force with nuclear weapons pointing at Los Angeles. People are going to go crazy. I mean, I'm telling you, and it's going to be a crisis in our relationship with you, and it's going to be a crisis in our relationship potentially even with the Japanese, because the Japanese have just passed, or about to pass today, no, not today, next Monday, collective self-defense law. But that law does not come into force until April 1st of next year. So there's a big window. So is the U.S. going to use its missile defense with the Japanese and potentially working with Korea as well to stop this missile from being, once it's launched? You know, you have to really stop it on the ascent phase. Otherwise, you have, you know, while it's going up, you have about 2 minutes. You have to, you know, I don't know if we'll even be able to technically be able to do it. But if we don't, and they succeed in testing it, they're going to have the ability to use that data because, you know, they have to, the North Koreans need data to be able to really perfect their nuclear ICBM capability. I personally, as an American who's, you know, served proudly with the ROK and is very proud of our alliance, will be outraged if this occurs because I do not like being threatened by these punk asses in North Korea. They've gone after me way too many times, and I'm sick of them. And you should be sick of them too. Because North Korea is a proliferation threat. I countered North Korean nuclear proliferation all over the world personally. I went after the AQ-CON network. I was part of that. I was a big part of going after Namcheonggung, North Korea's nuclear company. I can tell you, these guys mean business. They're building a massive stockpile of enriched uranium. Who is paying for it? North Korea's economy is really, really in trouble. And moreover, there's no need for any HEU bombs. North Korea already has plutonium bombs. We don't really know how many, but people say 8 to 10. I don't know. We really don't know. I think the HEU is for sale. I think, and the question is, and I was deeply involved in the HEU program in terms of pursuing it. When the U.S. first got word of it, along with the ROK in 2001, 2002, it was very disturbing. It was, you know, we were trying to finish the Kumho reactor sites up in North Korea and maintain the agreed framework. This was a disaster for the agreed framework. It was a clandestine program. But remember, the program was never just North Korea. It was part of the AQ-CON proliferation network, which was tied into who? The Iranians. In 2002, while I was in charge of North Korea for the U.S. State Department and National Security Council staff in terms of countering nuclear proliferation and illicit activities and the regime, Kim Jong-nam, the president of North Korea, or the state representative, went with Dr. Yoon Ho-jin, the head of North Korea's nuclear program procurement, to Syria and signed a science and technology agreement. We got pictures of this in the newspapers in Syria of them signing. Yoon was there, Kim's there, they're all shaking hands, smiling with Assad. We didn't know what that was about. Science and technology with North Korea. What science and technology do they have to give to the Syrians? And then, interestingly, Syria had a relationship with what country? Iran? Okay. In 2012, September 1st, North Korea signed its first science and technology agreement with any country since that 2002 agreement. It was with the Iranians. What did that 2002 agreement lead to? It led to the building of a nuclear weapons complex on at Al-Kabar on the Euphrates River. That was the single biggest act of nuclear proliferation in the history of the world, okay? I was in the six-party talks as the U.S. delegation advisor. Chris Hill would not even let us raise that issue in the talks because it was too sensitive. I found that very ironic. We went to war in Iraq over a WMD program that didn't actually exist, and here's a WMD program being built next door, potentially for the Iranians, no one really knows, but for the Syrians, who are certainly allies with Iran, by the North Koreans, and we're not doing anything to stop it. Okay? Well, so the danger is this. The science and technology agreement that Iran signed in 2002 could possibly have involved, that Syria signed with North Korea in 2002, could possibly have involved the Iranians too. Nobody knows. John Bolton has said this. Other people have said that. I don't think we know, but we have to be suspicious. When Al-Kabar broke ground, according to the Der Spiegel German article about it, this all public information, I think it was October of 2003. The CIA's national intelligence estimate that was declassified in 2005 said that the Iranian nuclear program stopped around October, November 2003. Is that a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that the North Korean HEU program went really active in the fall of 2003, early 2004 in terms of production? You know, they started to make the cascades and build the capabilities, we believe. I mean, that's all based on what's in the public eye. I don't believe in coincidences. But what really bothers me is that North Korea has a market for its nuclear weapons and its missiles, and it's called the Middle East. What we got is a war in the Middle East today between ISIS, the Sunnis, and Iran, the Shia. And if there's ever a time where countries want nuclear weapons more than today, I don't know when it is. So in World War I, they wanted dreadnoughts, they wanted tanks, they wanted mines, and they wanted gas. Today, they want nuclear weapons. And my fear is, as much as the world oil markets are collapsing today, a war in the Middle East involving the Iranians targeting the economic infrastructure of Saudi Arabia, which appears to be what their goal is with the Houthis in Yemen. We've already seen some missiles launched into Iran, into Saudi Arabia, excuse me, from Yemen. And the danger, of course, is that we're going to see potential targeting of oil, excuse me. The world still runs on oil. Oil at $25 a barrel is a great thing, you know? But oil at $170 or $200 a barrel would not be a great thing. The potential for conflict in the Middle East to set the world economy, which is already in distressed condition, as I'm pointing out, especially here in Asia, into an absolute mega crisis because of North Korean nuclear proliferation into the Gulf that leads Saudi to go into nuclear proliferation with the Pakistanis, which leads to actual energy warfare, which I think has already begun in terms of the pricing. It could be a total mess. So I just want to suggest that we need to stop thinking just about peace. We need to start thinking about war. We need to start thinking about World War III and how it could start. It could start in the South China Sea. It could start here, very likely. But if it starts here, it's going to involve all of us. Okay? My conclusions are this. The Asian economic financial disorder can turn into an outright global disorder without decisive reflation. So just on a financial level, we're facing a big problem. Chinese economic crisis is a Communist Party crisis, one that Lenin would recognize as the contradictions between communists, capitalists, and the people. China is becoming more nationalist, mercantilist, and expansionist. The chances of China turning the 114-step march into a turn back against time, move against Taiwan, and liberating the Korean Peninsula by 2017 are rising, okay, somehow or another. As a policing power, the U.S. is in recline and potentially in absolute decline. But I don't think it's in absolute decline. I think we're in recline. The world remains leveraged to Gulf oil, and the Middle East is in the first stage of an outright Sunni-Shia war that could eventually go nuclear and involve targeting of oil facilities, which would be like refineries, which would be very hard to replace. Market would go crazy. There are many internal or endogenous reasons for the long economic growth cycle which has existed since 1953. Typically, we have these 70-year growth cycles to be peaking out. If you look at the decline in productivity, decline in global trade, these are all classic indicators of a beginning of a hegemonic breakdown in a long cycle. A breakdown in the balance of power and multipolarity, which the CIA predicts according to their intelligence estimate that they published, is not inherently benign. It's going to be very dangerous. Does a pre-World War I-like downturn in the economic long cycle matter to the future of the world system, or is this time different? I don't think this time is different. But a U.S.-led globalization renaissance is possible. TPP could be passed by the Congress. The U.S. could try to engage our South Korean and Southeast Asian allies and our friends in Australia, which are all going to be facing big problems. We need to get ahead of this economic financial crisis, and we need to try to plan to try to balance it out, do deleveraging funds like I did with Japan to try to cut the corporate leverage in economies that are dependent, ahead of the curve, and not wait for the next big crisis. So I've talked too long. Thank you.
Wow. David never disappoint you. It was very illuminating and penetrating, but some points are quite provocative, but is thought-provoking presentations and a lot of wake-up calls, and we should pay attention to some of his early warnings. on China, most people do have worries, but there are more optimistic views, and I have my own views. But in any case, the presentation was great and very, very presented in candid way, and a lot to talk about, to discuss, and to think about. Now, since we don't have much time, let me invite you some comments or questions, only if you, in a very, very succinct way. Yes, Dr. Kim, yes, please.
David, thank you very much. As usual, you are a very exciting speaker. Now, you convinced us all of the very decisive need for deflation. Now, the question is, how can this be executed in a very broad sense without creating the global crisis or the breakup of the existing paradigm?
Okay, and anyone else? Okay, then while...
I mean, I think the simple thing is the Chinese are going to they've got a financial crisis in China. It's sitting there. They're going to have to recap their banking system. And in the Southeast Asian commodities trading markets and in countries like even Australia, they're going to have to adopt a deleveraging formula. They're going to have to get out. We're going to have to work out these corporate debts starting now as if they're already in default. You know, a preemptive formula for restructuring of these debts with the credit holders is better than waiting for an absolute crisis when everyone starts to panic sell. Because, I mean, to me, the writing's on the wall. There's no way that the commodities markets are going to surge back to growth. If China stimulates now, which I think they may, they're trying, it's probably going to have to occur through devaluation of their currency. That's going to lead to an absolute further crisis in commodities. So, I mean, you know, we can get ahead of the curve and we can have a frank discussion about this stuff, or we can stick our heads in the sand. And right now, I think we have our heads in the sand. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Hong, and Dr. Wang, just make it very short, please.
You haven't mentioned that Federal Reserve sooner or later might lift the interest rate. And everybody worries about the impact, especially on EM market. So could you give your forecast, the impact of interest rate lifting on China first? And among EMs, distinguish between commodity exporting EMs and manufacturing export EM like Korea and so on. So three categories will be your reply.
I got you. Great question.
Dr. Wang, Professor.
I'd like to ask your argument on the growth rate and the overvaluation of RMB.
Yeah.
You said 3% growth rate. 10% growth rate for 30 years would be too much exaggerated, I think. But what's the basis for about 3%? He said, now, do you have some? Did you look at the some accounting special accounting system in China?
Yeah.
And then secondly, overvaluation matter. Do you think that China should devalue 20 to 25% then? Then why China's product is so competitive in the international market? They are growing. They have tremendous surplus. Do you think the surplus is possible with 20% overvaluation? So
yeah, no,
I will talk about your basis for your argument, okay? Thank you.
Okay, so I think there's going to be a bunch of October surprises, personally. I think September, the Fed will probably delay action. But I think that one of the big surprises will be that we're going to get some more growth in the U.S. economy than we expect. Unemployment's already at a level that's consistent with raising interest rates. But because of what's going on in Asia, I think the Fed may well delay. But I think it would delay like 1 month. So, but my fear is October surprises might be worse than September expectation. So, Fed raises rates in October, Beijing devalues or repegs at a lower level. That's another scenario, not just devalue. They may just say, today the currency is worth X, tomorrow it's worth 20% less than X. They could just declare that. I think that would stem the outflow. And by the way, they can stop all Chinese tourists from leaving. They could stop, to go shop in Korea and in Japan and all these places they're going. They could create a wall to stop the capital from leaving the country just by physically stopping people from leaving, and even, and when they come back, they can take away the goods they bring in. So there's ways the Chinese could enforce this very draconian thing. I think the Bank of Japan will probably have to ease in October. I think we're going to see massive bankruptcies in the shale producing sector in the United States, which is going to cause credit instability in global credit markets. I think oil prices by then could fall below $35. I think it is a scenario. It's not certain. It may be more December likelihood, but I think it's possible. And I think gold and copper will break the 20-year low very soon, probably in October. So, you know, it's not just what the Fed does. It's going to be all this other stuff. And so the possibility for huge volatility spike in the fall, October, we've had some bad problems in the global markets before, I'm afraid. In terms of Chinese growth rate, we've done a lot of testing. I have, my firm, in support of my clients, using what's called Granger causality. Dr. Sakon can explain. But we use a lot of the partner country statistics, and we run them against the Chinese statistics. And we try to see if they mirror each other, if they follow each other. And we find that they really don't very well. They used to, okay? And that's a problem. So extrapolating from the partner country trade statistics for China and using Chinese statistics where we have long time series like electricity and production of cement, the Chinese economy is growing at 3% optimistically based on our analysis. Again, the index that I created is the same index that Li Keqiang, the premier, said that he uses. Now, it doesn't include the services sector, but my belief is the data for the services sector in China is so poor, you really can't really trust it. Okay, so my sense is what I can't trust is like the export data and the import data and the industrial production data. And they're all, as I showed, based on Chinese own PMIs and Chinese own actual backward data, you know, in production, all heading down, decisively downward. So a 25% currency devaluation would improve China's terms of trade, and it would then put China back in line with the rest of the Asian economies, including Korea, in terms of currency.
Yeah. Well, according to IMF, since 2014, the start of 2014, Chinese renminbi has been appreciated by around 30% on real effective exchange rate base. And so still Chinese renminbi is a bit overvalued. That is the IMF's estimation, as that's the consensus view, I suppose, is a little bit overvalued. But whether China will really devalue more or not is, I think, is a separate question.
If they don't, I think it invites an internal crisis.
Yeah. Well, I think there's different view, and because, as you said, Chinese problem is also China has so much dollar-denominated foreign debt, and therefore devaluation may hurt themselves more in different channels. And also China is very eager to include the renminbi in SDR basket, which will be reviewed this year. In fact, last devaluation was very on this kind of strategic base. Okay, well, but this, we'll see what will happen. And then FOMC, I don't think they will meet in October.
Oh,
they will meet in December.
It'll meet in December.
In December,
unless they have an emergency.
Right, another emergency meeting. Okay.
I'm sorry.
The other one, I think, David is not only one who think Chinese statistics has flawed and a problem. But on the other hand, there are people who are saying that it's not that bad. And because the statistics they usually use, who don't trust Chinese statistics, use mostly on this physical data, cement consumption, oil, the oil consumption, and mostly manufacturing-related data, and so forth. And those who they argue against this kind of the argument is that now Chinese industrial structure itself is changing toward more services. For example, only 4 or 5 years ago, Chinese service sector was only less than 45% of GDP, but now it's already 50%. So as economy shift towards service, of course, we will consume less energy and less physical inputs. And so I don't think we can trust on 100%, but even then, the discrepancy cannot be that low. And then the data collection on services always has time lag. So that is another problem. So this, again, I think we have to be careful about this number. I'm not for or to defend Chinese, but we should be aware that there are counter arguments, and then another thing is, in terms of economic analysis, what is important is trend. If they didn't lie before and all of a sudden they lie, then it can be a problem. But if they lied consistently, then the trend analysis it wouldn't affect. But anyway, so since it is a controversial issue, and so I think we have to be careful. By the way, on the September 21st. Monday following next week, to balance the point of view, I invited Chinese expert.
Good.
To talk about.
I'd like to be there.
Right. Yeah, you should be back. And Huang Weiping, he's a rising scholar in China, and he's young and brilliant, and is quite influential in Chinese policy-making circles. So he will tell us what Chinese is doing and what this so-called new normal Xinjiang is about, and we should bring you back there.
Well, I look forward to that.
But anyway, so and his many warnings from the financial markets perspective, I think has a lot of messages we should really be paying much attention to it. Okay, now what other things I want to say? Okay, now is there any other last question or comment? Yes, there is one hand there.
Please.
Yes.
안녕하세요. 저 조선비즈 연선욱 기자인데요. 박사님께서 아시아 지역 외환위기가 발생할 가능성이 있다는 분석을 내놓으셨는데 그거를 촉발할 수 있는, 그러니까 외환위기가 현실화될 수 있는 어떤 이벤트가 있다고 보시는지에 대한 답변 부탁드립니다.
I think that Chinese allowing their currency to further depreciate would be the most likely trigger. I think that's still to me the most likely scenario after the Xi-Obama summit. Again, why devalue? First, it's not really a devaluation. The Chinese I talk to say, look, everybody's devalued against us. We've massively appreciated against the dollar, against the yen, even against now the yuan. And by the way, Chinese export competitiveness is not as great as it used to be. I mean, the Vietnamese, Thailand, I mean, there's a lot of robotization going on in Korean production. I mean, China is not as competitive as it was before. Moreover, a weaker renminbi, yes, it'll earn more if they're exporting and earning in dollars. They're going to earn a lot of dollars. It depends on the volume of the trade and the competitiveness of the trade. So, frankly, I think that it's not necessarily a net negative in terms of their dollar accumulations. I think they could accumulate even more dollars because they'll be exporting the same goods and earning more money, being more competitive and earning even more dollars. So, and I think, and I may be wrong, that there is an October 27, 28 FMOC meeting, at least it was supposed to occur. I mean, I'm a little unclear as to whether that schedule was officially changed. If you look at the Fed's website, initially they announced one for October, at the end of October. I mean, the Fed actually has some latitude on this, so we'll see exactly what happens. But frankly, my concern is that, it may be an October surprise, it may be a December surprise. But we're facing surprises. And as I've tried to say, is what's surprising to me is that people have forgotten about all these, what surprises have done historically in the midst of all these very complicated and fragile conditions. And I'm not that pessimistic, actually. I just think we need to look at reality and understand history. If we do it, we should have a big Asian summit right now, like in the next 2 months. Maybe IGE could help host it with all the veterans of the Asian financial crisis. And we should say, let's look at these problems and let's say, what are the policies we can enact to avoid this? And maybe we need to have a talk with the Chinese and to say that if they're going to allow their currency to change, it's going to be based on some formula, and it's a gradual adjustment strategy or something. I don't know what that something is. You went through the Plaza Louvre days. I mean, we sort of planned adjustments back then. They still were dramatic, but they had less trauma, less, impact in some ways because they were at least just planned at a high level. Right now, we're just letting the market run wild. And I'm for the market. I mean, if China wants to open also liberalize its current account, capital account, currency is going to weaken. It's inevitable in my analysis, And maybe that's good. Maybe then we can all buy Chinese factories that are going to be very cheap, that are going to, there's going to be a lot of excess supply. We can buy in cheaply. China can open up and become a more democratic capitalist country. Why aren't we talking to China about democracy? This country became a capitalist democracy, in a miraculous way in 1987, 88. And if this country could become a capitalist democracy, and Taiwan can be, China could be. Why aren't we talking about it? Instead, we're letting the Communist Party act like the Communist Party.
Yeah. Well, I think it is very important to put things in a historical perspective, and actually that's why we invited you here to share your enlightening views, and you, as I said, the points you're making are very, very relevant and to chew on and to think about. I just want to remind you again the interesting incident, interesting happening. The 1929 U.S. stock market collapse occurred, I think, October 25th or something like that. 3 days before the collapse, there were the most distinguished, renowned economist at Yale called Irving Fisher, who is still very well-respected economist, gave a public speech 3 days before the collapse, and he said the U.S. stock market must be on a permanent plateau, on a high permanent plateau, and in my view, in his view, stock is still underpriced. And then 3 days later, it happened. But he's still well respected because of his other contributions. So we never know. So he, as he said, probability may not be that high, but there is a possibility, and that can happen.
And remember, there's like I said in '97 to '99, the U.S. did just fine, even while Asia was, people were pulling their gold out of their teeth here in Korea. I just want to say thank you. First, I want to say thank you to KJ for her incredible hard work putting this event together, and I want to say thank you to Dr. Sakong. He is a global treasure, not just a national treasure. He is one of the most famous and respected global financial figures. People all over the world know who he is. It's wonderful to be able to sit here with not only one of the greatest leaders in economic history of this country, but one of the world's true economic leaders, and to have so many of you who are successful business people and diplomats and scholars all here to at least just think about this. I mean, I'm happy to share my slides with you. I'm happy to receive emails back and forth. I would love to come back to Korea to hear the Chinese guy talk.
Sure.
And I was intended to be provocative, okay? So I may be wrong, but I'm at least trying to get us to think ahead by looking backward in the historical lens, and thank you very much.
We really, really appreciate it. As I said, actually, we've been having so many distinguished speakers and the lecturers but I don't think you have seen any more passionate and more enthusiastic, and
Hyperactive.
more candid, and very, very analytic, and is a good friend of Korean. Although he doesn't speak Korean as fluently, he speaks Japanese, but he's friend of Korea.
감사합니다.
Okay. Okay.